The terminal entrance was a blur of hurried footsteps and muffled announcements, a world of polished floors and flickering screens that seemed to hum with impatience. Dr. Leonard Wright moved through it all with a quiet grace, his walking stick tapping softly against the tiles, each step deliberate, measured. He carried no flashy luggage, just a simple leather satchel slung over one shoulder. His coat was modest, his shoes worn but clean, his presence so unassuming that most travelers passed him without a second glance. But there was a steadiness in his eyes, a calm authority that lingered like a shadow, unnoticed by those too busy to see. Leonard was no stranger to airports, to the rhythm of crowds and the weight of fleeting judgments. He'd spent decades as a surgeon, his hands steady in operating rooms where lives hung in the balance. Now retired, he was a discreet investor in the airline he was about to board, a fact known only to a handful of executives. Today, he wanted nothing more than a quiet flight, a chance to sit and think, to let the world blur past him for a few hours. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. As he approached the boarding tunnel for Flight XY482, an international journey bound for a distant city, Leonard handed his ticket to a young gate agent named Tariq. The agent scanned it with a quick flick of his wrist, barely looking up. "You're good, sir? Have a safe flight," Tariq said, his voice flat, routine. Leonard nodded politely and stepped into the tunnel, the faint echo of his stick blending with the hum of the air conditioning. The premium cabin awaited him, a world of plush seats and soft lighting, a small reward for a life of service. But before he could reach it, the air shifted. At the entrance to the airplane, a woman stood like a sentinel, her posture rigid, her uniform crisp. Clara, the lead flight attendant, was in her late 30s, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to measure everyone who crossed her path. Her smile was practiced, professional, but it didn't reach her gaze. As Leonard stepped forward, her hand rose slightly, a subtle but unmistakable signal to stop. "Good afternoon, sir," Clara said, her voice smooth but edged with something colder. "May I see your boarding pass?" Leonard handed it over without hesitation, his expression calm, his fingers steady. She glanced at the ticket, then up at him, her smile tightening. "And your ID, please," she added, her tone no longer a request but a demand. He tilted his head slightly, puzzled but unruffled. "You've got my boarding pass," he said softly, his voice low, like a breeze passing through a quiet room. "Yes," Clara replied, her eyes narrowing. "But I need to verify your identity further." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication, as if the man before her couldn't possibly belong in the premium cabin. A few passengers behind Leonard shifted uncomfortably, their carry-ons rustling. No one spoke. The boarding tunnel, usually alive with chatter, fell into a tense hush. Leonard reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his ID with the same calm deliberation he'd used to navigate countless crises in his career. He handed it to Clara, who studied it with a scrutiny that felt more like suspicion than procedure. "This doesn't quite add up," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. "Where did you get this ticket?" "I purchased it," Leonard replied, his tone even, unshaken. "Online, like everyone else." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Please step aside," she said, gesturing to the wall of the tunnel. "I need to confirm this with the gate staff." Leonard didn't argue. He moved to the side, his walking stick resting lightly against the floor, his posture straight but not defiant. Other passengers began to file past, some casting curious glances, others avoiding his gaze entirely. Clara stepped away, her radio crackling as she spoke in hushed, urgent tones. The word verify cut through the static, sharp and deliberate. "What do you think it feels like to be singled out like that? Judged before you've even had a chance to explain? Have you ever been in a moment where silence felt louder than words? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story." Minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Leonard stood patiently, his satchel still slung over his shoulder, his eyes fixed on the far end of the tunnel where the airplane's open door gleamed. He wasn't angry, not yet. But there was a familiar ache in his chest. The kind that came from being questioned not for what he'd done, but for who people assumed he was. It was a weight he'd carried for years, through hospital corridors and boardrooms, a weight that never seemed to lighten. Finally, a ground supervisor named Jamil appeared, his expression a mix of irritation and professionalism. He took Leonard's ID, glanced at it, then at Leonard himself. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and made a brief call. His face softened almost instantly, his voice dropping to a respectful murmur. When he hung up, he turned to Clara, his tone firm. "He's cleared. Let him board." Clara blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "But I thought—" "You thought wrong," Jamil cut in, his voice low but unyielding. "He's good to go." Clara stepped aside, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Leonard gave her a slight nod, not angry, not warm, just distant, and walked past, his stick tapping softly as he entered the airplane. The premium cabin opened before him, its elegance a stark contrast to the tension that still lingered in the air. Plush seats glowed under soft ambient lighting, the faint scent of coffee and leather welcoming him. But as he reached his seat and settled in, placing his stick beside him, the warmth of the cabin felt hollow. No one spoke to him. No one apologized. Clara busied herself at the front, her movements sharp and deliberate, as if she could erase the moment by ignoring it. The other passengers, business travelers in tailored suits, a young couple with matching headphones, kept their eyes on their phones or out the windows. The silence was heavy, oppressive, a shared discomfort no one dared to break. Leonard fastened his seatbelt, his hands steady but his thoughts far from calm. He wasn't new to this. He'd faced skepticism before, nurses who'd questioned his credentials, patients who'd doubted his expertise, colleagues who'd raised eyebrows at his presence in elite circles. But here, in a space meant for comfort, the sting was sharper. It wasn't just Clara's words. It was her eyes, the way they'd sized him up and found him wanting. It was the assumption, unspoken but clear, you don't belong here. As the plane rolled toward the airstrip, Clara moved through the cabin, her smile returning as she offered drinks to the other passengers. "Champagne, sir? A warm towel, ma'am?" Her voice was bright, rehearsed, but when she reached Leonard's row, she slowed, then passed without a glance. Not a word, not an offer. It was as if he'd become invisible, a ghost in seat 3A. He didn't react. He folded his hands in his lap, his gaze drifting to the window where the taxi lane stretched into the distance. The sky was clear, the horizon endless, but inside the cabin, the air felt thick with unspoken truths. Leonard knew this wasn't just forgetfulness. It was deliberate, a silent punishment for daring to challenge Clara's authority, for proving her wrong. Across the aisle, a man in a gray blazer, Elliot, a tech consultant, noticed. He leaned back, his eyes flicking toward Leonard, then to Clara's retreating figure. "She didn't offer you anything," he said quietly, almost to himself. Leonard turned his head slightly. "No," he said, his voice calm, steady. "She didn't." Elliot shifted uncomfortably. "That's not right." Leonard's lips curved into a faint, weary smile. "It's not." Elliot looked away, his fingers tapping restlessly on his armrest. Like most in the cabin, he wasn't used to stepping into moments like this. It was easier to notice an injustice than to name it, easier to feel guilt than to act. Leonard understood that. He'd seen it before, in operating rooms where no one questioned a mistake, in meetings where silence protected the powerful. But understanding didn't dull the ache. His phone buzzed softly in his coat pocket. He pulled it out, the screen glowing with a message from Omar, a longtime friend and fellow investor. "Just landed in London. Board meeting set for tomorrow. You good for the flight?" Leonard's fingers hovered over the keys, his thoughts heavy. He typed a reply. "Boarding issue. Got questioned again. Ignored now. I'm fine." Omar's response was instant. "Same old nonsense. Don't let it slide, Leonard. People need to learn." Leonard stared at the words, his thumb brushing the edge of the phone. He wasn't sure he wanted a fight. Not today. Not here. But Omar's message lingered, a quiet challenge. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and leaned back, his eyes closing briefly as the plane's engines began to rumble. The flight was only a few hours, but he had a feeling it would feel longer, for someone. In the service nook, Clara stood with her back to the cabin, her hands arranging trays with mechanical precision. A junior attendant, Lila, hovered nearby, her eyes darting nervously between Clara and the curtain separating them from the passengers. The tension was palpable, a current running beneath the surface of their routine. "You sure he's supposed to be in premium?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara didn't look up. "I've been doing this for 16 years, Lila. I know who belongs up here." "But his name was on the manifest," Lila pressed, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. I checked it myself. Clara's hands paused, her jaw tightening. Sometimes names get mixed up. Someone could have gifted him that ticket, or he pulled strings. It didn't feel right. Lila hesitated, then lowered her voice further. But Jamil said. I don't care what Jamil said, Clara snapped, her eyes flashing. I was being careful. That's my job. Lila fell silent, her gaze dropping to the floor. She wanted to say more, to point out that Clara hadn't questioned anyone else, that the man with the walking stick had been singled out for no reason she could name. But she didn't. Not yet. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've been cleared for takeoff. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all devices are in airplane mode. Thank you for flying with us today. The plane turned onto the airstrip, its engines roaring to life. Leonard opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on the seatback in front of him. The familiar jolt of takeoff pressed him into his seat, the world tilting as the airplane climbed. He'd always loved this moment, the brief weightlessness, the promise of escape, but today it felt different. The cabin was a stage, and he was at its center, whether he wanted to be or not. As the seatbelt sign chimed off, Clara reappeared, her smile back in place. She moved through the premium cabin with practiced ease, offering menus, pouring wine, calling passengers by name. Mr. Thompson, would you like the salmon or the steak? Mrs. Carter, another pillow? Her voice was warm, inviting, until she reached Leonard's row. She slowed, her tray tilting slightly, then walked past without a word. No menu, no drink, no acknowledgement. Elliot noticed again. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. She did it again. Skipped you completely. Leonard didn't turn his head. I know, he said softly, his tone carrying a weight that made Elliot pause. That's not okay, Elliot said, his voice louder now, drawing a glance from a woman 2 rows back, Nadia, a professor traveling to a conference. She'd been watching silently, her laptop open but untouched. Leonard finally looked at Elliot, his eyes steady, unreadable. It's not, he agreed, but it's not new. Elliot opened his mouth to say more, then stopped. He wasn't sure what to do with that truth, with the calm way Leonard carried it. Nadia, meanwhile, closed her laptop quietly, her fingers lingering on the lid. She'd seen the whole scene unfold, the ID check, the delay, the deliberate neglect, and hadn't said a word. Now the silence in the cabin felt like her own failure, a weight she couldn't shake. Leonard reached for his phone again, opening a message thread with Hassan, another ally in the airline's leadership. He typed quickly, Flight XY482. Staff issue. Questioned my ticket, held me up, now ignoring me, no apology. Hassan's reply was immediate. Flight number confirmed. Stay seated. I'm handling it. Leonard locked the phone and set it on the tray table, his fingers brushing the handle of his walking stick. The stick wasn't just a tool. It was a reminder of a surgery gone wrong years ago, a patient he'd saved but at the cost of his own mobility. It symbolized his resilience, his ability to stand tall even when the world tried to push him down. Today, that resilience felt more necessary than ever. In the service nook, Clara poured herself a cup of water, her hands steady but her mind racing. She knew she'd crossed a line when she stopped Leonard, knew at the moment Jamil had corrected her. But admitting that meant questioning 16 years of instincts, of trusting her gut to spot who belonged and who didn't. She wasn't ready for that, not yet. Lila stood nearby, her voice soft but insistent. You didn't offer him anything, Clara, not even water. Clara's grip tightened on the cup. I was busy, she said, the lie brittle in her mouth. Busy with everyone else, Lila replied, her eyes searching Clara's face. Why not him? Clara turned away, her jaw clenched. You wouldn't understand, she muttered, but the words felt hollow even to her. She didn't understand it herself, not fully. All she knew was that something about Leonard had unsettled her, something she couldn't name but felt compelled to challenge. The intercom buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She answered it, her voice clipped. This is Clara. A voice on the other end spoke briefly, and her face paled. Now? She asked, her tone betraying a crack in her composure. The voice replied firmly. She nodded, her throat tight. Understood. She hung up and stood frozen for a moment, her eyes darting to the flight deck door. Then, with a deep breath, she straightened her jacket and walked toward it, each step heavier than the last. The door opened, and the captain stepped aside, letting her in. Inside the flight deck, the co-pilot glanced at her, but it was the screen on the console that held her attention. On it was Karim, the director of airline operations, his face stern, his voice colder than the altitude outside. "Clara," he said, "we've received a complaint. A serious one." Clara stood straight, her shoulders tense. "What kind of complaint, sir?" "From a premium cabin passenger," Karim replied, his eyes unblinking. "About being stopped at boarding, questioned publicly, asked for extra ID and told implicitly that they didn't belong. And now, it seems, you've been ignoring them entirely." Clara's lips parted, but her voice faltered. "Sir, I was following protocol. The ID didn't seem—" "It wasn't about the ID," Karim cut in, his tone sharp enough to slice through her excuses. "That man is Dr. Leonard Wright, retired surgeon, respected philanthropist, and a significant shareholder in this airline. You didn't recognize him. Fine. But you assumed he didn't belong. Not fine." Clara's breath caught, her hands trembling at her sides. I didn't know." "You will now," Karim said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You'll apologize to him, publicly, in front of the cabin, and you'll serve him personally for the rest of this flight. No more mistakes." Clara nodded, her throat so tight she could barely swallow. "Yes, sir. And when we land," Karim added, "you'll report to the board. Understood?" "Yes, sir," she whispered, the words barely audible. The screen went dark, and the flight deck fell silent. The captain looked at her, his expression unreadable. Clara turned and walked out, her steps unsteady, her face pale. The curtain to the premium cabin loomed ahead, a barrier she wasn't sure she could cross. But she had no choice. As she stepped through, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers glanced up, sensing the shift in the air. Elliot stopped scrolling on his phone. Nadia set her book down, her eyes sharp. Even the young couple in the back paused their whispered conversation. Clara's heart pounded, each beat a reminder of the moment she'd created, the moment she couldn't undo. She stopped at Leonard's row, her tray forgotten, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. He was reading a small book, his stick resting beside him, his posture calm but immovable, like a mountain that had weathered countless storms. She crouched slightly, lowering herself to his level, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry. "Dr. Wright," she began, forcing the words out, "I owe you an apology. There was a misunderstanding at boarding. I shouldn't have questioned your ticket or delayed you. I'm deeply sorry." Leonard looked up slowly, his eyes meeting hers. They weren't angry, but they weren't forgiving either. They were steady, piercing, the kind of gaze that saw through masks and excuses. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice soft but deliberate, each word a weight. Clara nodded too quickly. "Yes, sir. I didn't recognize you. I was trying to be thorough." "You didn't ask anyone else for extra ID," Leonard said, his tone calm but unrelenting. "You didn't stop the man in the suit or the woman with the designer bag. You stopped me. Loudly. In front of everyone." Clara's face flushed, her hands trembling visibly now. I didn't mean to offend you," she stammered. "It wasn't personal." "But it was," Leonard replied, his voice cutting through her defenses like a scalpel. "You saw me, my coat, my stick, my face, and you decided I didn't belong. That's as personal as it gets." The cabin was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy with truth. Passengers stared, some openly, others pretending not to. Elliot's jaw tightened. Nadia's eyes glistened, her hand pressed to her lips. Clara stood frozen, her apology unraveling under the weight of Leonard's words. "I'm sorry," she said again, quieter now, her voice breaking. "I'll make sure you're taken care of for the rest of the flight." Leonard didn't respond. He turned his gaze back to his book, the pages untouched but open, a quiet dismissal more powerful than any shout. Clara stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked back to the service nook, the eyes of the cabin following her every step. The whispers began, soft, cautious, but undeniable. The passengers who'd stayed silent before were awake now, their discomfort a mirror of her own. In the nook, Lila stood waiting, her eyes wide with questions she didn't dare ask. "What did he say?" she whispered as Clara passed. Clara didn't answer. She grabbed a tray, her hands moving on autopilot, arranging cups and napkins as if order could restore what she'd lost. But her mind was a storm, replaying Leonard's words, his calm, unflinching truth. She'd spent years commanding cabins, controlling every moment, but today she was the one exposed, stripped of the authority she'd worn like armor. Leonard took a slow breath, his fingers brushing the edge of his book. He wasn't reading. Not really. His mind was sharp, alert, cataloging every glance, every shift in the cabin's mood. He hadn't wanted this confrontation, hadn't sought the spotlight. But he'd learned long ago that silence could be a weapon, wielded by those who assumed no one would notice. Today he'd chosen to speak, not for himself, but for every person who'd ever been dismissed, overlooked, judged by a glance. Across the aisle, Elliot leaned forward again, his voice low, hesitant. "Sir, I should have said something earlier. When she stopped you, I saw it, and I stayed quiet. I'm sorry." Leonard turned his head, studying him for a moment. "It's easier to stay quiet," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "until you realize silence is what lets moments like that grow." Elliot nodded, his eyes dropping to his hands. "You're right. I should have known better." Leonard gave a small nod, then looked away, his gaze drifting to the window. The clouds outside were endless, a sea of white that stretched beyond the horizon. But inside the cabin, the storm was just beginning, a reckoning that would linger long after the plane touched down. What would you have done in Elliot's place? Would you have spoken up, or would the weight of silence have held you back? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters. The airplane's engines hummed steadily, a low pulse that vibrated through the premium cabin of Flight XY482. Outside, the clouds drifted like silent promises, endless and untouchable. But inside, the air was thick with consequence. Dr. Leonard Wright sat in seat 3A, his walking stick resting beside him. Its polished wood a quiet testament to battles fought and won. His book lay open on the tray table, but his eyes weren't on the pages. They were distant, thoughtful, tracing memories older than the flight, deeper than the moment that had just unfolded. Clara's apology still hung in the air, fragile and incomplete, like a glass cracked but not yet shattered. The passengers around Leonard had settled into an uneasy quiet, their earlier whispers fading into stolen glances and fidgeting hands. No one wanted to meet his gaze, not out of malice, but out of shame, the kind that creeps in when you realize you've been complicit in something you can't unsee. The cabin's plush seats and soft lighting couldn't mask the truth. What had happened wasn't just a mistake, it was a mirror, and no one liked what it reflected. Leonard's fingers brushed the handle of his stick, the wood warm from his touch. He wasn't angry, not in the way people expected, with raised voices or clenched fists. His was a quieter fire, born from years of standing tall against assumptions, of proving himself in rooms where his presence was questioned before his words were heard. He'd saved lives with those hands, steadied hearts that had stopped beating. Yet here, in this polished cabin, he'd been reduced to a question mark by a woman who hadn't even asked his name. Across the aisle, Elliot shifted in his seat, his laptop open but untouched. He'd spoken to Leonard once, offered an apology that felt too small, and now the weight of that moment pressed harder against him. He glanced at Leonard, then away, his fingers tapping restlessly on the armrest. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost reluctant. "What she did, how no one stopped her." Leonard turned his head slightly, his eyes steady, searching. "You're thinking about it now," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "That's a start." Elliot nodded, but his expression was troubled. "It shouldn't have taken this long. I saw her stop you, saw the way she looked at you. I should have said something right then." Leonard's gaze softened, just a fraction. "Most people don't," he said. "Not because they don't care, but because it's easier to believe it's not their place." Elliot's jaw tightened. "It was my place. It was all of ours." Leonard didn't respond immediately. He let the words sit, let the silence do its work. He'd learned long ago that truth didn't always need a megaphone. Sometimes it was the pause between sentences that hit hardest. Elliot leaned back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, wrestling with a guilt that wasn't his alone. 2 rows back, Nadia watched the exchange, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She'd been silent through it all. The boarding tunnel confrontation, Clara's neglect, even the forced apology. Her notebook, filled with lecture notes for the conference she was attending, lay closed on her tray. She couldn't focus, not anymore. The scene kept replaying in her mind. Leonard standing patiently as Clara questioned him, the way his dignity held firm even as hers crumbled. She wanted to speak, to say something, but the words caught in her throat, tangled in her own hesitation. Have you ever watched something wrong unfold and wished you'd acted differently? What stopped you? Fear, uncertainty, or something else? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice could inspire someone else to speak up. In the service nook, Clara stood with her back to the curtain, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. The tray she'd carried earlier sat abandoned, the cups and napkins untouched. Lila hovered nearby, her eyes darting between Clara and the cabin beyond. The tension between them was a living thing, sharp and unyielding, but neither wanted to name it. "You okay?" Lila asked finally, her voice soft but cautious. Clara didn't turn. "I'm fine," she said, the words clipped, brittle. "You don't look fine," Lila pressed, stepping closer. "You haven't moved since you came back." Clara's shoulders tensed, her fingers tightening on the counter. "What do you want me to say, Lila? That I messed up? That I'm sorry? I said it already." "You said it because you had to," Lila replied, her tone gentle but unflinching. "Not because you meant it." Clara spun around, her eyes flashing. "You think you know me? 16 years, Lila. 16 years I've worked this job, kept cabins calm, handled drunks, sick kids, delayed flights. I don't make mistakes like this." Lila didn't flinch. "You did today." The words landed like a slap, and for a moment Clara's face betrayed her, a flicker of doubt, of fear, before the mask snapped back into place. "You don't get it," she said, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. "I was protecting the cabin, making sure everything was right." "Was it right?" Lila asked, her eyes searching Clara's face. "Stopping him? Ignoring him? Was that protecting anyone?" Clara opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came. She turned away, her breath uneven, her thoughts a tangled mess. She'd always trusted her instincts, prided herself on reading people, spotting trouble before it started. But now, those instincts felt like a trap, one she'd walked into without realizing. The intercom buzzed, pulling her from her spiral. She reached for it, her hand unsteady. "This is Clara," she said, forcing her voice to steady. "Clara, it's the captain," came the reply, calm but firm. "We're at cruising altitude. Final service in 20 minutes. Make sure Dr. Wright is served first." Clara's stomach twisted. "Understood," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hung up, her hand lingering on the receiver, her eyes fixed on nothing. Lila watched her, hesitant. "You want me to take his order?" "No," Clara snapped, then softened, her shoulders sagging. "No, it has to be me." She grabbed a fresh tray, her movements mechanical, arranging a glass, a bottle of sparkling water, a small dish of almonds. Her hands shook slightly, betraying the calm she tried to project. She wasn't just serving a passenger. She was facing a reckoning, one she wasn't sure she could handle. As Clara stepped back into the cabin, the air seemed to shift, the passengers' eyes tracking her like silent judges. She moved slowly, deliberately, her tray steady but her heart pounding. Leonard's row loomed ahead, each step a reminder of the moment she'd created, the moment she couldn't escape. He was still reading, or pretending to, his book open, but his gaze distant, thoughtful. His walking stick leaned against the seat, a quiet symbol of his strength, his resilience. Clara stopped at his row, her voice low but clear, carrying just enough for the cabin to hear. "Dr. Wright," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Would you like something to drink? Sparkling water, coffee, or perhaps something else?" Leonard looked up slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was no anger in them, no triumph, just a steady, unflinching clarity that made her want to look away. "You didn't offer me anything earlier," he said, his voice calm but pointed, each word a weight. Clara's smile faltered, her tray tilting slightly. I was attending to other passengers," she said, the excuse sounding hollow even to her. "Not all of them," Leonard replied, his tone even, unrelenting. "Just the ones you thought belonged here." The words hit like a quiet thunderclap, rippling through the cabin. Elliot froze, his laptop forgotten. Nadia's breath caught, her hand pressing against her notebook. The young couple in the back exchanged a glance, their headphones dangling. Clara stood rooted, her face flushing, her throat tight with words she couldn't find. "I'm sorry," she said again, softer now, her voice trembling. "I'll get you whatever you need." "Coffee," Leonard said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. "Black." Clara nodded, her hands fumbling as she poured the coffee, the thermos shaking slightly. She set the cup down carefully, her fingers brushing the tray as if it could anchor her. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "That's all." Leonard said, his tone final, dismissive without being cruel. He picked up the cup, his movements slow, deliberate, and took a sip, his gaze shifting back to the window. Clara turned and walked away, her steps quick, unsteady. The cabin watched her go, the whisper starting again, soft, cautious, but growing louder. She ducked into the service nook, her breath ragged, her hands pressed against the counter to steady herself. Lila was there, her eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" Lila asked, her voice gentle but urgent. Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was a storm of shame and defiance, of truths she wasn't ready to face. She'd spent years building this role, lead attendant, confident in control, and now it was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of one man's quiet dignity. Back in his seat, Leonard set the coffee down, the warmth lingering in his hands. He wasn't savoring a victory. He didn't see it that way. Victory implied a game, and this was no game. This was about truth, about accountability, about the countless others who'd faced the same judgment and had no voice to challenge it. His phone buzzed softly, a new message from Hassan glowing on the screen. "Board's been informed. Security will meet the plane. Stay seated after landing." Leonard typed a reply. "Understood." She apologized again. "Doesn't change much." Hassan's response was quick. "It's a start. But apologies don't fix systems. We're working on that." Leonard locked the phone and leaned back, his eyes drifting to the clouds outside. The sky was vast, endless, a reminder of how small these moments could seem in the grand scheme of things. But he knew better. Small moments, quiet judgments, unspoken assumptions, could ripple outward, shaping lives, breaking spirits. He'd seen it in hospitals, in communities, in his own life. Today, he'd chosen to ripple back. In the flight deck, the captain checked the altitude, his hands steady on the controls. He'd heard about the incident, heard Karim's orders to Clara, and now he felt the weight of it pressing against the routine of the flight. He reached for the internal phone, dialing the ground operations team. "Flight XY482, he said, his voice calm but firm. "Approaching descent in 40 minutes. Prepare for arrival, and have security ready at the gate." "Copy that," came the reply, clipped and professional. "Executive team's been briefed. They'll meet the plane." The captain hung up, his eyes flicking to the co-pilot. "This one's gonna leave a mark," he said quietly. The co-pilot nodded, his expression unreadable. "It already has." Back in the cabin, Nadia finally found her voice. She leaned forward, her words soft but clear, directed at Leonard. "Dr. Wright," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I just want to say thank you for how you handled that, for not letting it slide." Leonard turned his head, studying her for a moment. "Handled what?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. "The way she treated you," Nadia said, her eyes glistening. "The way you stayed calm, spoke truth. It showed us something." "And what was that?" Leonard asked, his voice steady, inviting. "That you don't need to shout to be heard," Nadia replied, her voice breaking slightly. "That dignity is louder than anger." Leonard gave a small nod, his eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes the loudest thing in a room is what you choose not to say." Nadia smiled faintly, her hands trembling as she clutched her notebook. "It was noticed," she said, "by more than just me." Leonard turned back to the window, his reflection faint against the glass. The clouds were thinning now, the first glimpses of land appearing below, city lights, highways, the distant shimmer of an airport. The plane was descending, not just in altitude, but into a moment that would linger long after the wheels touched the ground. What does dignity mean to you? Have you ever seen someone stand tall in the face of disrespect and felt changed by it? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. In the service nook, Clara stood frozen, her hand still pressed against the counter. The captain's announcement about the final service echoed in her ears, a reminder that time was running out. She'd served Leonard's coffee, faced his truth, but the weight of it hadn't lifted. It had grown heavier, pressing against her chest like a stone. She knew what waited at the gate: security, executives, questions she wasn't ready to answer. For the first time in her career, she felt small, not because she'd been caught, but because she'd been seen. Lila stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clara, you need to sit down. You're shaking." "I'm fine," Clara said, but her voice cracked, betraying her. She wasn't fine. She was unraveling, thread by thread, and the cabin knew it. The passengers knew it. Leonard knew it. "You're not," Lila said gently. And that's okay, but you can't keep pretending nothing happened. Clara's eyes flashed, a spark of defiance flaring. You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel it? Then do something about it, Leela said, her tone firm but kind. Not for the board, not for the passengers, for you. Clara's breath hitched, her hands falling to her sides. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to cling to the version of Clara who was always in control. But that version was slipping away, and what remained was raw, uncertain, human. She didn't know how to face it. Not yet. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, steady and routine. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent in about 20 minutes. Please ensure your tray tables are stowed and seatbelts fastened. Flight crew, prepare for final service. Clara straightened, her hands moving automatically to the tray. She couldn't hide in the nook forever. She had a job to finish, a cabin to serve, a man to face one last time before the plane landed. She stepped back into the cabin, her smile forced, her tray steady but her heart racing. The passengers watched her, their eyes sharp with judgment, curiosity, pity. She felt every glance, every whisper, like needles against her skin. When she reached Leonard's row, he was looking out the window, his coffee cup empty, his book closed. She paused, her voice low, trembling. "Dr. Wright, would you like anything else before we land?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was no softness in them, but no cruelty either, just truth, unyielding and clear. "You've done enough," he said, his voice quiet but final. Clara nodded, her throat tight, and moved on, her tray heavier than ever. Behind her the cabin stirred, Elliot exchanging a glance with Nadia, the young couple whispering again, the weight of the moment settling deeper into everyone's bones. Leonard leaned back, his fingers brushing his stick, his gaze fixed on the approaching ground below. The plane dipped lower, the city sprawling beneath it like a map of possibilities and promises. But for Clara, for Leonard, for every soul in that cabin, the real descent wasn't about altitude. It was about facing what waited at the gate, what waited within themselves. And as the wheels groaned softly, preparing for landing, one truth was clear. This flight was far from over. The airplane's descent felt like a slow unraveling, the world below growing sharper with every passing minute. Flight XY482 cut through the thinning clouds, the city's lights blinking like distant stars, but inside the premium cabin, the air was heavy with anticipation. Dr. Leonard Wright sat in seat 3A, his walking stick a quiet sentinel beside him, his hands folded calmly in his lap. The coffee cup Clara had placed on his tray sat empty, its warmth long gone, but its presence lingered, a small, fragile bridge between apology and accountability. The cabin was quieter now, the earlier whispers replaced by a tense hush. Passengers fidgeted with their belongings, their eyes darting between Leonard and the curtain where Clara had disappeared. Her forced smile, her trembling hands, her faltering words, they'd left a mark, not just on her, but on everyone who'd witnessed it. The plush seats and soft lighting couldn't hide the truth. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a reckoning, and no one could look away. Leonard's gaze drifted to the window, where the city sprawled beneath them, a tapestry of lives and stories he'd once stitched together with his surgeon's hands. He wasn't here for revenge. He'd never been that kind of man. But he was tired, bone-deep tired, of carrying his dignity like a shield, of proving himself in spaces where others were welcomed without question. Today, he'd chosen to stand firm, not for himself alone, but for every person who'd ever been made to feel less than, their worth measured by a glance. Across the aisle, Elliot sat with his laptop closed, his hands restless. He'd spoken to Leonard twice now, each time grappling with his own silence, his failure to act when Clara had singled Leonard out. The guilt hadn't faded, it had grown, rooting itself deeper with every moment he replayed in his mind. "I keep thinking," he said suddenly, his voice low, hesitant, "about what it must feel like, to be you in that moment, to stay so calm." Leonard turned his head, his eyes steady, searching. "Calm isn't the absence of feeling," he said softly. "It's what you do with it." Elliot nodded, his throat tight. "I don't know if I could have done that. I'd have been angry, loud." "Anger's easy," Leonard replied, his voice gentle but firm. "It's what comes after that's hard." Elliot leaned back, his eyes distant, wrestling with a truth he wasn't sure he could carry. 2 rows back, Nadia watched them, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She'd found her voice once, thanking Leonard for his dignity, but now the weight of her own silence pressed harder. She wanted to speak again, to bridge the gap between witness and ally, but the words felt heavy, tangled in her fear of saying the wrong thing. Have you ever felt stuck in silence, wanting to speak but unsure how? What would it take to break that barrier? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone find their voice. In the service nook, Clara stood alone, the curtain drawn tight behind her. The tray she'd carried earlier sat abandoned, its contents untouched, a silent accusation of her unraveling control. Lila had stepped away, giving her space, but the absence only made the silence louder. Clara's hands pressed against the counter, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. She'd served Leonard's coffee, faced his truth, but it hadn't erased the moment. It had magnified it, exposing every crack in the armor she'd worn for 16 years. Her mind raced, replaying every second, the boarding tunnel, her sharp words, the way Leonard's calm had dismantled her authority without a single raised voice. She'd always prided herself on control, over cabins, over passengers, over chaos. But now, control was slipping through her fingers like sand. She wasn't just facing Leonard anymore. She was facing herself, and what she saw was unfamiliar, unsettling. The intercom buzzed, sharp and insistent. Clara flinched, her hand reaching for it automatically. "This is Clara," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Clara, it's the captain," came the reply, calm but weighted. "We're 10 minutes from landing. Prepare the cabin, and ensure Dr. Wright is comfortable." Clara's stomach twisted, a fresh wave of dread washing over her. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice barely audible. She hung up, her hand lingering on the receiver, her eyes fixed on the curtain. She had to go back out there, had to face the cabin again, had to face him. But every step felt like walking toward a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her. She straightened her jacket, smoothed her hair, forced her shoulders back. She was still the lead attendant, still in charge, at least for the next 10 minutes. But the mirror on the Nook's wall caught her reflection, and for a moment she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were tired, her mouth tight, her confidence a mask that no longer fit. As she stepped through the curtain, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers glanced up, their eyes sharp with curiosity, judgment, pity. Elliot paused, his fingers hovering over his armrest. Nadia's pen stilled, her notebook open but blank. The young couple in the back lowered their voices, their headphones dangling. Clara moved slowly, her posture rigid, her tray forgotten. She wasn't serving now, she was surviving, each step a test of her resolve. When she reached Leonard's row, he was looking out the window, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. His walking stick rested beside him, its presence a quiet reminder of his strength, his resilience. Clara cleared her throat, her voice low, trembling. "Dr. Wright, we're preparing for landing. Is there anything you need?" Leonard turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting hers. It wasn't angry, wasn't cruel, but it was unflinching, a mirror she couldn't escape. "You've asked that before," he said, his voice calm but pointed. "The answer hasn't changed." Clara nodded, her throat tight, and stepped back, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. She moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts, stowing tray tables, her movements mechanical, her smile forced. But the passengers' eyes followed her, their silence louder than any words. They'd seen her apology, heard Leonard's response, felt the weight of the moment. And now they were waiting. For what? They weren't sure. But they knew it wasn't over. Back in his seat, Leonard fastened his seatbelt, his hands steady but his thoughts heavy. He wasn't here to punish Clara, he'd never wanted that. But he couldn't let her actions slide, couldn't let the system that allowed them to fester in silence. His phone buzzed softly, a new message from Omar glowing on the screen. "Security's in place. Aishanor's meeting the plane. Stay seated, let them handle it." Leonard typed a reply, "Copy." "It's bigger than her now." Omar's response was immediate, always was. "You're just the one who made them see it." Leonard locked the phone and set it down, his fingers brushing the handle of his stick. He wasn't chasing a spotlight, wasn't seeking applause. But he'd spent too many years watching people in power sidestep accountability, their mistakes buried under protocol and politeness. Today he'd chosen to dig deeper, to expose the roots of a problem that stretched far beyond one flight. In the flight deck, the captain adjusted the controls. the runway lights now visible in the distance. He'd flown countless routes, landed in storms and delays, but this flight felt different. The incident wasn't just a report, it was a shift, a crack in the foundation of routine. He reached for the internal phone, dialing ground operations. "Flight XY482, he said, his voice steady. 5 minutes to touchdown. Security and executives at the gate?" "Confirmed," came the reply, crisp and professional. "Aisha, Noor, and Yusuf are on site. They'll board first." "Copy," the captain said, hanging up. He glanced at the co-pilot, his expression unreadable. "This one's going to Echo." The co-pilot nodded, his hands steady on the controls. "It already is." The plane dipped lower, the wheels groaning softly as they prepared for landing. In the cabin, passengers braced themselves, their seatbelts tight, their eyes fixed on the floor. The windows, anywhere but Clara. She stood at the front, her hands folded tightly, her face pale but composed. The routine of landing, announcements, checks, final sweeps, felt distant, unreal. Her mind wasn't on procedure. It was on the gate, on the faces waiting there, on the badge pinned to her jacket that suddenly felt heavier than ever. The wheels hit the runway with a gentle thud, the cabin vibrating as the plane slowed. Outside, the world rushed past in streaks. Runway lights, ground vehicles, the looming silhouette of the terminal. But inside, time seemed to pause, the cabin holding its breath. No one clapped, no one chattered. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of what had happened, what was still to come. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and routine. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your destination. Local time is 4:12 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us." The seatbelt sign chimed off, but no one moved. At the gate, a black SUV waited just beyond the boarding tunnel, its doors closed, its windows tinted. Beside it stood two figures, Aisha Noor, Vice President of Corporate Affairs, and Yusuf, Head of Crew Training. A uniformed security officer lingered nearby, his posture alert but neutral. The tunnel was empty, the door to the plane still sealed, but the air was charged, waiting. Clara stood near the front, her headset in place, her hands trembling as she pressed the call button for the gate agent. "This is Flight XY482, she said, her voice steady but thin. "We've landed, awaiting clearance to open the door." The reply was brief, clipped. "Hold for instruction. Executives boarding momentarily." Clara's heart pounded, her breath shallow. Executives, plural. She turned slowly, facing the cabin, her eyes avoiding Leonard's row. For the first time in her career, she felt like a passenger herself, powerless, waiting for someone else to decide her fate. The cabin watched her, their silence a weight she couldn't shake. She'd spent years commanding these spaces, but now she was the one exposed, her authority stripped away by her own choices. Leonard remained seated, his stick beside him, his posture calm but unyielding. He hadn't spoken since Clara's last attempt, hadn't moved except to adjust his seatbelt. But his presence filled the cabin, a quiet force that demanded attention without asking for it. Passengers glanced at him, some with awe, others with guilt, their eyes reflecting the truth they couldn't ignore. This man had changed the air they breathed, not with anger, but with dignity. Elliot leaned forward, his voice low, urgent. "Dr. Wright, I need you to know what you did. It matters. Not just to you, to all of us." Leonard turned his head, his eyes steady but kind. "What I did was sit," he said softly. "What matters is what happens next." Elliot nodded, his throat tight. "I hope it's something real." Leonard gave a small nod, his gaze drifting back to the window. The plane had stopped at the gate, the engines winding down, the world outside still and waiting. His phone buzzed softly, a final message from Hassan. "Aisha's taking point. No scene, just truth. You did enough." Leonard didn't reply. He didn't need to. The truth was already moving, rippling through the cabin, the airline, the system itself. He'd planted a seed, and whether it grew or withered wasn't up to him alone. A soft knock came from the door, deliberate, unmistakable. Lila moved to open it, her hands steady but her eyes wide. 3 figures stepped onto the plane, their presence shifting the air instantly. Aisha Noor led the way, her suit sharp, her expression unreadable but commanding. Behind her was Yusuf, his face calm but firm, and the security officer, silent but alert. The cabin froze, passengers holding their breath, their eyes tracking every movement. Aisha's gaze swept the cabin, pausing briefly on Leonard, a flicker of respect passing between them. Then she turned to Clara, who stood rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Clara," Aisha said, her voice low but clear, carrying through the cabin. "We need to speak with you. Now." Clara swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "Yes, ma'am." Aisha's eyes softened, just a fraction, but her tone remained firm. "Please hand your badge to Yusuf." Clara's breath caught, her hands trembling as she reached for the badge pinned to her jacket. The metal gleamed under the cabin lights, a symbol of everything she'd built. 16 years, countless flights, a career she'd thought untouchable. She unclipped it slowly, her fingers shaking, and passed it to Yusuf. He took it without a word, slipping it into his pocket with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any shout. The cabin was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy with consequence. Passengers stared, some openly, others pretending not to. Elliot's jaw tightened, his hands clenched in his lap. Nadia's eyes glistened, her notebook forgotten. Clara turned to follow Aisha, her steps slow, her face burning, but before she moved, she glanced at Leonard, one brief, fleeting look. He was still seated, still composed, watching but not gloating. His eyes weren't angry, weren't triumphant, just steady, a mirror reflecting her choices back at her. And somehow that was worse than any judgment she could have imagined. She looked away, her head low, and walked toward the door, Aisha and Yusuf flanking her, the security officer trailing behind. The door closed behind them with a soft click, but the sound reverberated through the cabin, a punctuation mark on a moment no one would forget. Leonard let out a slow breath, his fingers brushing his stick, his gaze fixed on the empty space where Clara had stood. He didn't feel victorious, not really. He felt resolved, certain that something had shifted, even if he couldn't yet name it. The cabin stirred, passengers shifting in their seats, their silence breaking into soft murmurs. Elliot turned to Leonard, his voice low, almost reverent. That was real, wasn't it?" Leonard nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "As real as it gets." Nadia leaned forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Dr. Wright, I should have spoken up sooner. I saw it all, and I didn't say anything. I'm sorry." Leonard turned to her, his gaze kind but unflinching. "You're saying it now?" he said softly. "That's what counts." Nadia's eyes glistened, a tear slipping down her cheek. "It doesn't feel like enough." "It's a start," Leonard said, his voice steady, a quiet promise that carried more weight than she expected. "What does it mean to break your silence, even when it feels too late? Have you ever found the courage to speak after staying quiet too long? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how you found your voice." The gate agent, a young woman named Sana, stepped onto the plane, her voice respectful but firm. "Dr. Wright," she said, addressing him directly, "your car is waiting. You're welcome to disembark first." Leonard didn't rush. He rose slowly, his stick steady in his hand, his satchel slung over his shoulder. His movements were deliberate, graceful, a reminder that strength didn't need haste. He walked past the other passengers, their eyes following him. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with something deeper, something like awe. He'd changed the cabin without raising his voice, shifted the air with nothing but truth. As he stepped into the boarding tunnel, the air felt crisper, sharper, charged with possibility. A black sedan waited beyond the glass, its driver standing respectfully beside the open door. Isha was there, her phone pressed to her ear, nodding as she spoke in low tones. She paused when she saw Leonard, offering a small, respectful nod. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Leonard slid into the back seat, his stick resting beside him, and the door closed softly. Inside the plane, the passengers began to move, but slowly, their steps heavy with the weight of what they'd witnessed. No one rushed to the aisle. No one chattered about plans or connections. The cabin felt different now, as if Leonard's presence had left an imprint, a quiet challenge to be better, to see clearer, to act braver. Nadia stood, retrieving her bag from the overhead bin, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced at Lila, who was now at the front, preparing to say goodbye to each passenger. "What happens to her?" Nadia asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Lila paused, choosing her words carefully. "No one's saying it out loud," she said, "but she'll have to answer for it. Really answer." Nadia nodded, her eyes distant. "I hope she listens this time." Lila's reply was simple, heavy with truth. "She will. She has to." Farther down the aisle, Elliot helped a woman with her bag, his movements quiet, deliberate. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to act now, to do something kind, but it was as if Leonard's presence had stirred something in him, a need to make up for the silence he'd carried too long. He glanced at Nadia, their eyes meeting briefly, a shared understanding passing between them. They'd both failed to speak, but they weren't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that meant they could try again. Outside, Leonard's car pulled away from the gate, the terminal lights fading behind him. He sat silently in the back, his gaze fixed on the passing buildings, his phone buzzing softly on the seat. A message from Omar. Board's meeting tonight. Aisha's pushing for policy review. You started something big, Leonard. Leonard read the message, his thumb brushing the screen. He didn't reply. Not yet. He wasn't sure what big meant, wasn't sure he wanted it. All he'd wanted was a quiet flight, a chance to rest. But life, he knew, had a way of turning rest into resolve, of turning one man's truth into a tide that could shift entire systems. The car turned onto a quiet road leading toward Leonard's residence in a secluded suburban area. The world outside was calm, the evening breeze carrying the scent of fresh grass and distant rain. But inside, Leonard's thoughts were alive, moving, tracing the ripples he'd set in motion. He didn't know where they'd lead, didn't know how far they'd reach. But he knew one thing. The silence had cracked, and from that crack, something new was growing. The black sedan glided through the quiet streets of Leonard's secluded suburban neighborhood, the city's pulse fading into a soft hum of evening calm. Dr. Leonard Wright sat in the back, his walking stick resting against his leg, its polished wood catching the faint glow of passing streetlights. His satchel lay beside him, unopened, a silent companion to thoughts that moved like currents beneath still water. The world outside was serene, trees swaying gently, porch lights flickering on. But inside, Leonard's mind was alive, tracing the weight of what had happened on Flight XY82, the ripples he'd set in motion without ever raising his voice. He wasn't a man who sought battles, but he'd never shied away from them either. Decades as a surgeon had taught him that some wounds couldn't heal unless they were opened, exposed to light. Today, Clara's actions had been a wound, not just to him, but to the system that let her assumptions pass as protocol. Leonard hadn't wanted to be the one to hold the scalpel, but life, he knew, didn't always give you a choice. His phone buzzed softly, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from Hassan glowed on the screen. Aisha's with the board now. Clara's badge is suspended pending review. They're talking policy overhaul. You okay? Leonard's thumb hovered over the keys, his eyes distant. He typed a reply. I'm fine. It's not about me anymore. Hassan's response was quick. Never was. But you made them listen. That's what counts. Leonard locked the phone and leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window. The car slowed as it approached his residence, a modest house nestled among old oaks, its garden blooming quietly under the evening sky. The driver opened the door, offering a respectful nod, but Leonard waved him off gently, stepping out with the same measured grace he'd carried onto the plane. His stick tapped softly against the stone path, each step a reminder of the injury that had changed his body, but not his resolve. Inside the house, the air was still, the silence a stark contrast to the charged cabin of XY482. Leonard set his satchel on a wooden table, his stick leaning against the wall like a faithful sentinel. He didn't turn on the lights. Not yet. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out at the garden, its flowers swaying in the breeze. For a moment, he was just Leonard. Not a surgeon, not a shareholder, not a symbol. Just a man who'd wanted a quiet flight and found himself at the center of a storm. But the storm wasn't his alone. Across the city, in a glass-walled meeting room at the airline's corporate office, Isha Noor stood before a long table, her presence commanding despite the late hour. The room was sleek, all steel and frosted glass, but the mood was heavy, weighed down by the incident that had traveled from a single flight to the highest levels of leadership. Around the table sat 6 executives: Bilal Hassan, head of crew management, Zara Khan, legal compliance, and others whose names carried weight, but whose faces were tight with unease. Aisha's voice was steady, her words deliberate. Flight XY482 wasn't an anomaly, she said, her eyes sweeping the room. It was a symptom. Clara's actions weren't just a mistake, they were enabled by a culture that lets bias hide behind procedure. Bilal leaned forward, his fingers laced tightly. She's been with us 16 years. No prior complaints. Are we sure this wasn't a one-off? Aisha's gaze didn't waver. 16 years doesn't excuse it. And it wasn't a one-off, it was a pattern, unnoticed because no one like Dr. Wright was in seat 3A before. He wasn't just a passenger, he's a stakeholder, a voice we can't ignore. Zara opened a folder, her expression unreadable. He hasn't filed a formal complaint. No legal action, no media. Why? Aisha paused, choosing her words carefully. Because he doesn't need to. What happened in that cabin spoke louder than any lawsuit. Passengers saw it. Crew saw it. We're hearing it now. The room fell silent, the truth settling like dust after a storm. Aisha walked to a whiteboard, uncapping a marker. In bold letters she wrote, Policy Review, Fairness Training, Public Commitment. She underlined each one, her movements sharp, purposeful. We start here, she said. We review every in-flight protocol. We train every employee, not just crew, but gate agents, supervisors, executives, on bias, on respect, on accountability. And we make a public statement, not to cover our tracks, but to own them. Bilal nodded slowly, his voice low. And Clara? Aisha's expression softened, just a fraction. She faces a review board. Her employment status depends on what they find, and what she's willing to learn. The executives exchanged glances, their silence heavy with the weight of change. Aisha capped the marker, her eyes scanning the room. This isn't about one flight, she said. It's about every flight after. We don't just fix this, we rebuild. Across town, in a small apartment filled with the clutter of a life on pause, Clara sat on a worn couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The navy blouse she'd worn to the airport felt foreign now, as if it belonged to someone else. Her badge was gone, confiscated at the gate, and with it, the identity she'd built over 16 years. The TV was off, the room quiet except for the faint hum of a refrigerator. She stared at the floor, her mind a tangle of shame, defiance, fear. She'd replayed the flight 100 times, Leonard's calm, her own sharp words. The moment Aisha had taken her badge. Each memory was a needle, pricking at the walls she'd built around herself. She'd always believed she was good at her job, efficient, professional, unshakable. But now efficiency felt like a mask, professionalism a shield that had failed her. She hadn't just misjudged Leonard, she'd misjudged herself. Her phone sat on the coffee table, its screen dark but heavy with notifications she hadn't opened. Messages from colleagues, questions from Lila, a formal email summoning her to a review board. She hadn't replied to any of them. Not yet. The thought of facing those questions, of explaining herself, made her chest tighten. What could she say? That she'd been careful? That she'd followed her gut? Her gut had been wrong, and the truth of that was louder than any defense she could muster. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window, her hands trembling. Outside, the city moved on, cars passing, lights flickering, lives untouched by the storm she was drowning in. She wanted to blame someone, Leonard, Lila, even Aisha, but the mirror in her living room caught her reflection, and the truth stared back. She'd made a choice, not because of protocol, but because of something deeper. Something she hadn't named until now. Bias. Fear. Assumption. The words felt foreign, but they fit, and that terrified her most of all. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to confront your own mistakes, not just to others, but to yourself? What did it teach you? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how you grew through it. Back at Leonard's residence, the evening had settled into a quiet rhythm. He sat in his study, a small room lined with books and memories. A framed photo of his surgical team, a worn journal from his early years, a vase of flowers from his garden. The press release from the airline lay open on his laptop, its words carefully chosen but heavy with intent. We are reviewing our in-flight service procedures following a recent incident. Our commitment to dignity, fairness, and respect for all passengers remains unwavering. New training programs are underway to ensure every traveler is welcomed equally. Leonard read it twice, not because he doubted its sincerity, but because he knew what it didn't say. It didn't name him, didn't name Clara, didn't admit the depth of the failure. But it was a start, a crack in the silence that had protected systems like this for too long. He leaned back, his fingers brushing the edge of his desk, his thoughts drifting to the passengers, Elliot, Nadia, the young couple, whose silence had been as much a part of the story as Clara's actions. His phone buzzed again, A message from Aisha. Board-approved training overhaul. First session next week. We'd like you to speak, if you're willing. Leonard stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. He hadn't asked for this role, hadn't wanted to be a symbol. But the invitation wasn't about him. It was about the next person in seat 3A, the next traveler stopped at a gate, the next life judged by a glance. He typed a reply. I'll consider it. Let me know details. He set the phone down and stood, his stick steady in his hand as he walked to the garden. The air was cool, the flowers glowing faintly under the moonlight. He paused by a rosebush, its petals soft against the night, and let the silence settle around him. It wasn't the heavy silence of the cabin, but a peaceful one. A reminder that change, like growth, started small. A seed, a crack, a single voice refusing to stay quiet. Meanwhile, at the airline's training facility, a conference hall buzzed with quiet preparation. Trainers moved chairs, tested projectors, arranged notebooks for the first session of the new fairness program. The room was unassuming, its walls lined with posters of smiling crew and soaring planes, but the mood was different, focused, deliberate, as if everyone knew the stakes had changed. Lila was there, her uniform crisp, her notebook filled with questions she hadn't dared ask on the flight. She wasn't sure what the training would hold, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to be silent again. In a nearby office, Yusuf sat with a stack of reports, Clara's file open before him. Her 16 years of service were impeccable. Awards, commendations, glowing reviews. But the incident report from XY482 was a shadow over it all, its details stark and undeniable. Passengers had submitted statements, Elliot's brief but honest, Nadia's thoughtful and heavy, even the young couples who'd admitted to watching without acting. None were cruel, none demanded punishment, but all told the same truth. Clara had judged Leonard before he'd spoken, and the cabin had let it happen. Yusuf leaned back, his fingers steepled, his thoughts heavy. Clara wasn't a villain. She was human, flawed, caught in a system that hadn't taught her to question her instincts. But systems didn't change unless people did, and Clara's review would be the first test of that truth. He made a note. Recommend retraining, not termination. Reflection over punishment. He wasn't sure if she'd accept it, wasn't sure if she could change. But he knew one thing. The airline couldn't afford to lose someone who might learn, not when learning was the point. Back in Clara's apartment, the silence was broken by a knock at the door. She froze, her heart racing, her hand smoothing her blouse as if it could steady her. She opened the door to find Lila, her uniform replaced by jeans and a sweater, her expression soft but resolute. "What are you doing here?" Clara asked, her voice tight, defensive. "I wanted to check on you," Lila said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "You haven't answered my texts." Clara turned away, her arms crossed. "I'm fine. I don't need checking on." "You're not fine," Lila said gently, closing the door behind her. "And you don't have to be, not after today." Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes glistening but defiant. "What do you want me to say, Lila? That I ruined everything? That I'm sorry? I said it already, and it didn't fix anything." Lila stepped closer, her voice steady but kind. "Maybe it's not about fixing it. Maybe it's about facing it, really facing it." Clara's breath hitched, her hands falling to her sides. "I don't know how," she whispered, the words breaking free like a dam giving way. "I keep seeing his face, Lila. Not angry, not gloating, just disappointed. Like I was someone he'd expected better from." Lila nodded, her eyes soft. "That's where it starts, Clara. With seeing him, really seeing him." Clara sank onto the couch, her hands covering her face, her shoulders trembling. For the first time since the flight, she didn't fight the tears. They came quietly, not in sobs but in steady streams, carrying the weight of truth she'd avoided too long. Lila sat beside her, silent but present, a reminder that change didn't come from isolation but from connection, from someone refusing to look away. What does it take to face a truth you've avoided? Have you ever had someone help you see yourself clearly, even when it hurt? Tell us in the comments. Your story could light the way for someone else. At Leonard's residence, the night had deepened, the garden now a silhouette against the sky. He sat on his porch, a sweater draped over his shoulders, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. The press release still lingered in his mind, its words a promise, but not a guarantee. He wasn't naive. He knew change was slow. New systems resisted truth until the pressure grew too great. But he also knew something else. Pressure started with one voice, one moment, one man in seat 3A who refused to be invisible. His phone buzzed again, a message from Nadia, forwarded through Hassan. "Dr. Wright, I don't know if this will reach you, but I needed to say it again. I'm sorry for staying silent. I'm learning from you. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." Leonard read the message twice, his expression softening. He didn't reply, not yet. But the words settled in him, a reminder that his choice hadn't just challenged Clara, hadn't just stirred the board. It had reached others, planted seeds he might never see bloom. He set the phone down and looked out at the garden, the roses swaying gently, their petals catching the moonlight. The airline's corporate office was still alive, its lights burning late into the night. Aisha stood by the whiteboard, now covered in notes. Timelines, training modules, a new benchmark labeled XY4A2 Principle. It wasn't a slogan, wasn't a brand. It was a commitment, a line in the sand. No passenger would be judged by appearance, no assumption would pass as protocol. The executives had left, but Aisha stayed, her fingers tracing the words, her mind on Leonard. She'd met him once, years ago, at a shareholder meeting, a quiet man with a steady gaze, his presence commanding without demanding. She hadn't known then that he'd be the one to force this change, but she wasn't surprised. Some people didn't seek the spotlight. They carried it, whether they wanted to or not. In Clara's apartment, the tears had slowed, but the weight remained. Lila sat quietly, her hand resting on Clara's arm, her presence a lifeline. "What happens now?" Clara asked, her voice raw, vulnerable. Lila hesitated, then spoke softly. "You go to the review. You tell the truth, not just about what happened, but why, and then you decide who you want to be after." Clara nodded, her eyes distant, her hands trembling but steadying. She wasn't ready, not yet, but for the first time, she felt the possibility of it, the chance to rebuild, not her badge, but herself. At Leonard's porch, the night was still, the stars bright above the garden. He stood slowly, his stick in hand, and walked back inside, the door closing softly behind him. The world was moving, policies shifting, hearts opening, silences breaking. But for now, he was just Leonard, a man who'd faced a storm and come through it whole. The story wasn't over. Not for him, not for Clara, not for the airline or the passengers who'd carried its weight. But as the night settled, one truth was clear. The ripples from seat 3A were spreading, and they wouldn't stop at the runway. The morning sun filtered through the oaks outside Dr. Leonard Wright's residence, casting dappled light across his garden. The roses glowed softly, their petals heavy with dew, a quiet testament to time and care. Leonard sat on his porch, a sweater draped over his shoulders, his walking stick resting against the chair. A cup of tea steamed gently in his hands, its warmth a small comfort against the weight of the past week. Flight XY482 was behind him, but its echoes lingered, not in anger, but in possibility, in the faint promise of change that hung like mist over his thoughts. He hadn't sought this role, hadn't wanted to be the spark that lit a fire, but life, he'd learned, didn't always ask permission. Decades as a surgeon had taught him to act when the moment demanded it, to cut through fear and doubt with steady hands. On that flight, he'd done just that, not with a scalpel, but with silence, with truth, with a refusal to let assumption pass as protocol. Now, as the world woke around him, he felt the ripples spreading, touching lives he might never meet. His phone sat on the table, its screen dark but heavy with messages. Hassan's updates, Aisha's invitation, even a note from Nadia, the passenger who'd found her voice too late, but found it still. Leonard hadn't replied to them all, not yet. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure he needed to. Some truths didn't live in words, they lived in action, in the quiet shifts that followed a storm. Across the city, in the airline's training facility, a conference hall hummed with anticipation. Rows of chairs faced a simple stage where a screen displayed 3 words in bold: dignity, equality, accountability. The room was filling slowly, flight attendants, gate agents, supervisors, even executives, each carrying a notebook, a question, a flicker of unease or hope. Lila was there, her uniform crisp, her eyes bright with purpose. She'd been on XY482, seen Clara's fall, felt the weight of her own silence. Today, she wasn't silent. She was ready to listen, to learn, to carry forward what Leonard had started. In a smaller office nearby, Clara sat on a plain chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The navy blouse she'd worn since losing her badge felt like a stranger's skin, but she wore it still, a reminder of who she'd been and who she might become. Across from her sat the review board, Yusuf, Aisha, and a personnel officer named Karam, each with a file open. Clara's 16 years laid bare on paper. Her awards, her evaluations, her incident report from XY482, they were all there, a map of a career now at a crossroads. Aisha spoke first, her voice calm but firm. Clara, we've reviewed the statements. Passengers, crew, Dr. Wright's own account. We've heard your side. Now we need to know. What have you learned? Clara's throat tightened, her eyes fixed on the table. She'd spent days preparing for this. Nights replaying the flight, the moment she'd stopped Leonard, the look in his eyes when she'd apologized. She'd wanted to defend herself, to cling to protocol, but the truth had grown too loud to ignore. I made a choice, she said finally, her voice low, trembling but clear. I looked at Dr. Wright and saw a question, not a person. I assumed he didn't belong, not because of his ticket, but because of me, my fear, my bias. I was wrong. Yusuf leaned forward, his expression unreadable. And what does that mean for you now? Clara's hands trembled, but she met his gaze. It means I have to change. Not just my actions, but how I see people. I've spent 16 years trusting my instincts, but instincts can lie. I need to learn better ones. Aisha nodded, her eyes softening, but not relenting. Change isn't a statement, Clara, it's work. Are you ready for that? Clara swallowed hard, her voice breaking. I don't know if I'm ready, but I want to be. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling like dust. Karim made a note, his pen scratching softly against the page. Aisha exchanged a glance with Yusuf, a silent agreement passing between them. We're recommending retraining, Aisha said finally. Not as punishment, but as opportunity. You keep your employment, but you start over. New modules, new oversight, and you meet with Dr. Wright if he agrees to hear him directly. Can you do that? Clara's breath caught, her eyes glistening. The thought of facing Leonard again, not as a passenger but as a man she'd wronged, was heavier than any board's judgment, but she nodded, her voice steady. Yes, I can. Back at the training hall, the session was about to begin. The room was full now, the air charged with a mix of curiosity and resolve. Lila sat near the front, her notebook open, her pen poised. She wasn't sure what to expect, wasn't sure who would speak, but she felt it, a shift, a turning point. The door opened, and heads turned as Leonard stepped inside, his stick tapping softly against the floor. He wore a simple blazer, no tie, his presence quiet but commanding, like a tide that needed no storm to move mountains. The room stilled, not out of fear but out of respect, a collective breath held for a man who'd changed their world without shouting. He nodded politely as he reached the stage, shaking hands with Yusuf, who'd introduced him. No fanfare, no applause, just silence, heavy with meaning. Leonard stepped to the podium, his stick resting beside him, his hands steady on the wood. He didn't adjust the microphone, didn't shuffle notes. He didn't need them. He looked out at the faces, young, old, guarded, open, and began, his voice low but clear, carrying the weight of a lifetime. I didn't plan to be here, he said, his eyes scanning the room. I didn't want a stage, didn't want a title. All I wanted was a seat on a flight, a chance to get home quietly. But sometimes life decides for you. On flight XY482, someone looked at me, my coat, my stick, my face, and decided I didn't belong. Not because of my ticket, but because of their eyes. The room was silent, every word landing like a stone in still water. Lila's pen stilled, her eyes fixed on Leonard. A senior attendant in the back shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. Leonard continued, his voice steady, unyielding. That moment wasn't new to me. I've felt it before, in hospitals, in boardrooms, in places where I was supposed to prove myself twice over. But what hurt most wasn't the question. It was the silence. The passengers who watched, the crew who looked away, the system that let it happen. Silence isn't neutral. It's a choice, and it lets wounds fester. He paused, letting the words settle, his gaze moving from face to face. But silence can break. It broke on that flight, not because I spoke loudly, but because I spoke at all. Because I stayed, because I refused to be invisible. And now you're here, all of you. Because that break matters, because what happens next depends on you. Lila's eyes glistened, her notebook forgotten. A young gate agent in the third row wiped his cheek, his head bowed. Leonard's voice softened, but its power grew, filling the room like a tide. This isn't about one woman, one flight, one mistake. It's about a system that trains you to check IDs, but not assumptions, to follow rules, but not hearts. If you can learn to spot a bag left behind, you can learn to spot bias in yourself. If you can handle a storm at 30,000 feet, you can handle the truth on the ground. You don't need slogans or posters. You need courage, the kind that starts with seeing every person as someone who belongs. He stepped away from the podium, his stick tapping softly as he moved to the edge of the stage. "I'm not here to shame you," he said, his voice quieter now, almost intimate. "I'm here to ask you to look, really look, at the people in your cabins, your gates, your lives. And when you see something wrong, don't wait for someone else to speak. Be the voice that breaks the silence." The room was still, the silence not heavy but alive, filled with reflection, with resolve. Then, slowly, a single clap broke the quiet, followed by another, then more, not loud, not performative, but steady, meaningful, a recognition of truth over triumph. Leonard nodded once, his expression calm, and stepped down, his stick steady, his presence unshaken. Lila stood, her hands trembling as she joined the applause, her eyes wet but bright. She wasn't clapping for Leonard alone. She was clapping for the chance to be better, for the truth he'd carried into that room. The session continued, trainers taking the stage, but Leonard's words lingered, a foundation for every lesson that followed. Have you ever heard a truth that changed how you saw the world? What did it inspire you to do? Share your story in the comments. Your voice could spark change for someone else. Across town, Clara sat in a quiet cafe, a letter in her hands. She'd written it that morning, each word a struggle, each sentence a step toward something new. It was addressed to Leonard, not as a passenger, not as a shareholder, but as a man she'd wronged. "Dr. Wright," it began, "I saw you as a mistake, a question, something out of place. That was my failure, not yours. I thought I was protecting my cabin, but I was protecting my fear. I thought I knew who belonged, but I was wrong. I'm learning now, not just to be better, but to see better. I hope you'll let me say this in person, not to erase what I did, but to own it." She folded the letter carefully, her hands steady for the first time in days. She didn't know if he'd read it, didn't know if he'd agree to meet. But writing it had been enough, not to fix the past, but to face it, to start the work Aisha had spoken of. She slipped the letter into an envelope and handed it to a courier, her heart lighter, not with forgiveness, but with possibility. At Leonard's residence, the day had unfolded quietly. He'd returned from the training session, his stick tapping softly as he walked to his study. The letter arrived that afternoon, delivered by hand, its weight more than paper. He read it slowly, his eyes tracing Clara's words, her honesty, her vulnerability. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. He placed the letter in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that change wasn't just systems, it was people, hearts, choices. He replied later, a single line, "I'll meet you. Name the time." The airline's transformation continued, quieter now, but no less real. Training sessions rolled out across hubs, not just lectures, but exercises, role plays, reflections, questions that cut deeper than checklists. The XY482 principle became a touchstone, not a rule, but a mindset. Every passenger was a person, every assumption a risk. Passenger complaints dropped, crew morale rose, and stories began to emerge. Attendants who'd stopped to listen, gate agents who'd questioned their instincts, travelers who felt seen, not just served. Nadia returned to her university, her lecture notes now laced with a new lesson, the power of speaking up, even when it's hard. She wrote Leonard a second letter, longer this time, thanking him for showing her that courage wasn't loud, it was steady, unshaken, true. Elliot, back in his tech office, started a mentorship program, inspired by Leonard's calm, a way to lift others who'd been overlooked. Lila trained harder, her voice stronger, her silence a thing of the past. Clara began retraining, her badge still gone, but her resolve growing. She sat in classes with new hires, her notebook filled with questions, not answers. It wasn't easy. Every lesson reminded her of XY482, of Leonard's eyes, of her own failure. But it was work, honest work, and she did it, not for applause, but for herself. At Leonard's garden, the evening settled softly, the roses glowing under a fading sky. He sat on his porch, his tea cold, but his heart warm. The press release had faded from headlines, the training sessions no longer news, but the change remained. quiet, steady, like roots beneath the earth. He'd spoken at one session, met Clara once, a conversation not of forgiveness, but of understanding, of moving forward. His phone buzzed, a message from Aisha. Board's offering you a permanent training role. No pressure, but you'd make a difference. Leonard smiled faintly, his eyes on the garden. He typed a reply, I've done my part. Let the next voice rise. He set the phone down and stood, his stick steady as he walked to the roses, their scent sweet against the night. The world was moving, policies shifting, hearts opening, silences breaking. And Leonard was at peace, not because he'd won, but because he'd stayed true. He'd sat in seat 3A, faced a storm, and come through it whole, not for himself, but for every soul who'd ever been stopped at a gate, judged by a glance, silenced by fear. The story of XY482 wasn't a headline, wasn't a scandal. It was a seed, planted by a man who'd chosen dignity over anger, truth over silence. And as the stars blinked above Leonard's garden, that seed was growing, not with noise, but with roots, deep, lasting, alive. What's the one truth you'll carry forward from this story? How will it shape the way you see others, the way you speak up? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep this change alive together.